1,000 years later, even my weakest follower has become a demon king. Chapter 1, Wuxia World Chapter 1, End Translator, Seektalan. I guess it's almost time. Zhou drew across the seemingly endless list of completed missions and muttered. More than 200 main missions, more than 2,000 side missions, more than 1,000 hidden environments, and all the achievements had been collected. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that he had completed all the game content that the developers of the VR RPG virtual reality role-playing game had designed. Platinuming a game couldn't get any better. As Zhou flipped through the game's records, he sighed at how much effort he had put into this game. Man, did I spend more than 13,000 hours on this game? This is a little exaggerated for a single-player game. Is there a second person in the world who has thrown more than 10,000 hours into the game? Zhou was surprised by the time he spent via the record breakdown. Zhou had always believed that he wasn't really living as a human during the 10-plus hours he toiled at his company. If he made this the measure of choice and deducted the time he spent sleeping every day, he was akin to a person living in the sword and magical world of the Doomsday Watchman than in the real world. However, all good things had to come to an end. It was finally time to say goodbye to this world. With this in mind, Zhou, who felt his heart gradually grow heavy, waved his hand and closed the statistics interface. It wasn't that he was tired of this game compared to the real world where he had to face all kinds of pressure every day. He found serenity from just looking at the scenery in the game's big continent. If possible, he really hoped that he could continue living this other life in-game. However, the pressure of reality was ever present. Having crossed the 30-year-old threshold, Zhou could already sense the invisible shackles gradually tightening, the shocking results of his physical examination, the pressure from his mortgage and car loans, the rumors in the company about retrenching older employees, and so on. He had to sacrifice sleep to squeeze out an hour or two for gaming. Meanwhile, his body, which hadn't been in the pinkest of health for a long time, had already begun to issue constant alarms. In the past half a year, he had fainted twice without any warning. His doctor and boss had seriously talked to him more than once. Suffering a sudden death or being retrenched weren't outcomes he wanted. After weighing the pros and cons, it was time to quit. Zhou looked up and surveyed his surroundings. At this moment, he was sitting at a huge obsidian round table in the middle of a magnificent hall that was like a pantheon in Rome. This was the Round Table Hall in the Twilight Fortress. Twilight Fortress was the headquarters of the Doomsday Watchers, a Salvation Army that wasn't restricted by borders. It was the closest place to home for players, and it was also the first stronghold the players arrived at in the main storyline. Before leaving completely, Zhou planned on giving himself a ceremonial farewell. Choosing this place to end it all could be said to be of extraordinary significance. It was both the beginning and the end. Zhou sat for a while longer when he heard chaotic footsteps outside. Then, the heavy adamantine door was pushed open, and the entire round table hall was divided into two by the light coming from the outside. The 12 men and women of different races entered one after another with the light as a backdrop and sat at the round table. Players could directly recruit 12 core NPCs to take up the Doomsday Watchers' 13 judges and, together, they would save the world with the protagonist based on the plot. Zhou swept his gaze across everyone present. Of course, not all of them were humans. There were also companions from other races. He couldn't help but recall the foolish things he had done in the past. Back then, to achieve a perfect clear, he basically had to reload dozens of times to farm satisfactory basic stats and characteristics for the NPCs to be recruited to be his judge. Moreover, he would choose the perk that suited them best to have synergy between their equipment. It could be said that every judge's character was better than most ordinary Doomsday Watchers. Presiding Judge William Kane, what gives us the pleasure of being summoned here? Perhaps the system had determined that Zhou hadn't spoken for too long, so a character in pitch-black armor and carrying a huge sword that was as thick as a door spoke. William Kane was the name of Zhou's character in this save. Zhou came back to his senses and cleared his throat. That's right, Blake Sava. I summoned all the judges here today because I have something important to announce. As Zhou spoke, he took a deep breath and spread his arms. I'm about to leave you forever. With that said, all the NPCs at the round table revealed looks of disbelief, panic, and even fear. The production company of Doomsday Watcher assigned extremely powerful AI programs for important NPCs in the game. As long as they didn't talk about things that went beyond the game's framework, their conversation and reaction were very close to that of a real person. Of course, this was essentially just a chat program. Jomu also knew that he was being silly bidding farewell to these NPCs. William, my friend, are you saying that you want to leave the Vic continent and adventure elsewhere? A scaly man with horns on his head and a thick tail on his back asked in a gruff voice. No, Dao King. I'm not just leaving this continent, but this entire world. With that said, there was another commotion. Are you saying that you plan on leaving the present and heading to the Moon Realm to head to the domain ruled by those void sovereigns? In that case, I ask to be part of your noble party. A humanoid wrapped in a cloak that constantly emitted ominous black mist asked in a singing tone. I'm not talking about the present or the Moon Realm. I'm talking about the entire world, everything. It reaches far beyond the present, the Moon Realm, the Light Realm, or the furthest border you can imagine. Only I can walk this path. I can only take my fond memories of you, nothing more. An elven girl wearing light leather armor and carrying a transparent bow and arrow on her back asked, Lord Kane, can you tell us why you have decided to leave? Because I have no choice. I do wish I could accompany all of you forever. But far away, some existences are graver than the 7 calamities and the void sovereigns that require me to fight them. What's that? Reality. The room fell silent. Every judge seemed to be thinking hard about what Jomu meant by reality. Of course, Jomu knew that it was impossible. It was just that the system had detected a conversation that went beyond the game's framework. In turn, it made the NPCs act as if they were in thought. They would then immediately change the topic. Then, the youngest-looking youth among the 12 spoke. He wore a cloak woven from black feathers and had amber eyes that resembled those of a ferocious bird. Will you be returning? I don't know, Coles, I'm not sure, but if that day really comes, I hope to see all of you again. I'll look forward to the day we reunite. As Jomu spoke, he pressed his hands on the obsidian round table and stood up. The other 12 people in front of the round table stood up with him. He looked at his companions in a daze. If only this world were real. Then, I hereby announce the disbandment of the 13 judges. We have brought 1,000 years of peace to this world by defeating the calamities and expelling the void sovereign. It's high time to seek out your own happiness. This is my last order, everyone. Do as you wish. What an idiotic speech. They were clearly just programs stored in the computer, and as long as he went offline, they would freeze at this moment forever. Yet, he still shamelessly said to them that he wanted them to pursue their own happiness. The thing about the day we reunite was even more impossible. He had already sold his gaming pod on an online platform. Tomorrow, he would pack it up and send it out. Reuniting was impossible. When Jomu thought of this, he bowed to everyone and silently activated the nexus on the obsidian round table. Teleportation. After a brief loading interface, Jomu arrived in an alternate space filled with stars. This was his treasure haul. He had too many rare items in his collection. Having a hoarder mentality, not only would he obtain things through the game's progression, but he could even produce useless assets that the developers ultimately didn't put into the game through the console. If it was only for display, the entire Twilight Fortress wouldn't be enough to hold half of his collection as a treasure haul. Therefore, he created such an alternate space through the game console that was specially used to store his vast collection. Every star in this boundless cosmos was a rare item wrapped in a space-time bubble. Jomu looked up at the stars in the sky. Then, farewell. He took a deep breath and pulled up the game menu before pressing the exit game button. His vision instantly turned pitch black. A notification alert would indicate that he had successfully logged off, returning him to the real world. Jomu silently counted his breaths and waited for the chime. For some reason, his subtle and mixed feelings became extremely calm. Yet, the offline indication chime didn't ring even minutes later. Chapter 2, Beginning. Translator, Seektalan. Is it stuck? Sensing that something was amiss, Jomu tried pulling out the game menu, but he failed. Game pod, log off. Nothing. Game pod, forced disconnection. There was still no reaction. A trace of fear surfaced from his heart. He had read an urban legend on a forum that someone had died in a game pod due to a malfunction. He had always written it off as a joke. After all, the VR game pod wasn't connected to the back of his head. There shouldn't be anything that sounded too sci-fi like being trapped in a game pod. But when he realized that he couldn't log off normally, he couldn't help but let his imagination run wild. Game pod, forceful eject, contact customer service. As Jomyu shouted all kinds of emergency orders, he raised his hand and planned on ripping off the VR helmet on his head. However, he was stunned the next second. What his hand touched wasn't the helmet but his face. Before he could figure out what this meant, Jomyu's vision suddenly lit up again. In front of him was a starry scene. He had returned to the treasure hall he was in before going offline. What's going on? Jomyu tried touching his face. At this moment, he wasn't wearing a VR helmet. He then touched the spot on his neck where the zipper of his sensor suit should have been, but he could only touch his Adam's apple. This meant that he wasn't wearing a force transmission suit or a VR helmet that could simulate his 5 senses. However, he still saw the scene of stars filling the treasure hall. It even looked clearer than before. It was as clear as the real world. An extremely ridiculous possibility surfaced in Jomyu's heart, causing his heart to race. Then, I'll test it. Jomyu gulped. Teleportation. There was no game UI interface or character interface, but when Jomyu thought of using teleportation, a gorgeous and complicated nexus automatically appeared in front of him. Then, many specks of light that symbolized coordinates appeared in his mind. In Doomsday Watcher, teleportation was equivalent to a quick travel function. Therefore, to teleport to a certain location, players had to first visit the location and unlock the coordinates there. Jomyu tried choosing the coordinates that symbolized the round table. As the nexus flashed, he appeared in the seat where he had bid farewell to the judges. Even the loading interface during teleportation in the past no longer existed. He looked at his hands in disbelief, finding it unbelievable that everything in front of him was real. So, did I transmigrate? No game in the world could complete a player's instructions with a thought. If he hadn't gone crazy from the pressure of work, there was only one possibility: he had transmigrated to the world of Doomsday Watcher. It was difficult to say what complicated changes Jomyu's emotions had undergone after he realized that he had transmigrated, but one thing was certain: he definitely didn't have the intention of returning. Jomyu didn't have any attachment to the real world, especially after his parents passed away a few years ago. Compared to the company and his extended family, having just lived on in reality thanks to inertia, he often felt that the world in Doomsday Watcher was a reality that belonged to him alone. Now that he had really come to this world, he naturally felt uneasy and terrified. After all, this was a world where magic and gods truly existed, a world filled with danger. However, Jomyu focused slightly. The plethora of magic he had learned in-game naturally appeared in his mind. He felt that as long as he was willing, he could use such powers at any time, just like when he used teleportation. For a moment, he trembled from excitement. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that as a product of his perfect clear goal, the character named William Kane in this save was inexplicably powerful based on the game's framework and background story. In the game, other than some bosses that required special conditions to defeat, he was confident in taking down even the strongest hidden boss publicly accepted on the player forum: Incarnation of Nothingness. Jomyu took a deep breath and calmed down slightly. He needed to calm down now. Since he had transmigrated and become the perfect clear account of William Kane, he had to confirm the level of his strength and see how the mechanisms of his various abilities were different from in-game. Then, he had to find his former companions. But speaking of which, why has the round table hall appear to be in ruins? After making up his mind, Jomyu noticed that something was amiss. He looked around. For some reason, the previously gorgeous and magnificent round table looked like it had been abandoned. For a long time, it was covered in a thick layer of dust. The murals on the dome had faded to an unrecognizable level. The Holy Spirit statue on the wall had been weathered into a beehive-like irregularity, and the flags hanging had long been reduced to dust. In the entire round table hall, only the obsidian round table and the heavy adamantine door remained intact. How long has it been? I left only a few minutes ago. None of this makes sense. Jomyu muttered in confusion before shaking his head. He had already transmigrated, so how could there be any logic? Perhaps he had transmigrated to an era many years later. With this in mind, the uneasiness in his heart increased. If he hadn't transmigrated to an era where the game plot happened, much of the information he knew would have lost its usefulness. More importantly, he didn't know if his companions could be found again. In short, he had to find someone to ask about the situation. At the very least, he had to figure out the era he was in. Life detection. Upon having this thought, Zhou activated a support spell. Invisible ripples spread out from him, and soon, the entire Twilight Fortress was within his casting range. Any creature's outline would be outlined by light green lines after being touched by the invisible ripples, allowing Zhou to see them even through obstacles. Unlike in-game where one could only detect humans or other medium-sized creatures, even small life forms like rats and insects were outlined here. Was this in line with the description of the skill in-game? Detection of all life auras in a large area. Zhou suspected that creatures like bacteria had also been detected, but he couldn't see them. Zhou stood up in thought. Lightning flashed on his right hand, and a deep spatial rift opened. His hand reached in and pulled out a staff that was completely made of frost. The tip of the staff was embedded with a blood-red magic sphere, and streams of light extended from the magic sphere to cover the entire staff like a spiderweb. Withering Cold was the magical medium he used the most in-game, not because it was strong, but mainly because it looked very cool. The reason why Zhou took out his magical medium was also very simple. He had seen the outlines of 3 human figures in the range of life detection. But other than one human figure on the ground that looked no different from a human, the other 2 had limbs that were too long for humans and huge heads. That distinct appearance reminded him of a monster in-game. Subdemon? It's actually inside the Twilight Fortress. Although Zhou didn't know how much time had passed, Twilight Fortress was originally built to fend off demonic creatures from the Moon Realm. No demonic creature should be able to stroll around and retreat unscathed here. Zhou rubbed the magical medium in his hand and thought to himself. This was the only thing that shouldn't have changed no matter how much time had passed. Chapter 3, Liliana. Translator. Siegtelin. Liliana von Bergman lay on the dusty ground and stared blankly at the bats dancing in the air. As a student of Offa University's archaeology department in the Blackwater province, she would definitely have danced excitedly in this hall if she had come here in a more dignified manner. It was difficult to imagine how much missing documentary information could be excavated from a well-preserved relic from the Coast Dynasty. If she could reveal the discoveries here to the academic world, she might even be guaranteed a spot as an associate professor in the university's archaeology department. However, her mentality was completely different, having been brought into the ruins to be stockpiled as food by the subdemons. 2 subdemons with abnormally long limbs and huge heads were chewing on meat. She tried her best not to think about what meat it was, in large mouthfuls as they smacked their lips while chatting about what to do with her next. So when can we start eating this woman? Is eating all that's on your mind? There's only one left. There will be none left once we finish her. We still have to stay here for some time. Then, it shouldn't be a problem to try a few mouthfuls as long as it's not fatal, right? Are you an idiot? The first bite will always be dedicated to the Lady of Starvation, Camilla. Can it still be used as a sacrifice? After being bitten by you, we can't keep a living person by our side, right? What if we encounter some danger and don't have the time to pay attention to her, allowing her to escape? Wouldn't that leak our arrangements here? Yes. That makes sense. Then, turn her into rations like before. Having a living person by our side is indeed a latent risk. Draw the runes for the ritual first. The conversation between the subdemons threw Liliana into despair. She was under a paralysis spell. Even if she wanted to beg for mercy, she would be tongue-tied and unable to speak. In this situation, she couldn't do anything other than silently pray to the 7 holy spirits for a miracle to happen. One of the subdemons appeared in Liliana's line of sight. Its skin seemed to be covered in mold, and there were signs of rot and festering everywhere. It opened its mouth that covered half its face and extended its long forked tongue to lick her cheek. Don't be afraid, don't be afraid. Your soul will soon reach the Moon Realm and reunite with your friends. There, you can ask them if they suffered before they died and compare notes. The subdemon held a ceremonial serrated dagger and pointed at the bones on the ground while speaking in a teasing manner. They were her companions who came exploring this ruin with her. Not long after they stepped into this ruin, they were attacked and killed by these 2 subdemons. Daddy, Mommy, help me. Looking at the dagger that was gradually approaching her, Liliana closed her eyes in despair. Tap, Tap, tap. It was also at this moment that light but very clear footsteps sounded from the corridor outside the front door. The hall immediately fell silent. Liliana opened her eyes in confusion. At this moment, the dagger-wielding subdemon was half-kneeling beside her, exchanging looks with the subdemon who was drawing something on the ground with a piece of charcoal. It placed its slender fingers beside its orifice that could hardly be called a mouth and made a shushing motion. Then, it gently stabbed the dagger back into its belt and slowly pulled out a short sword smeared with green venom. As for the other subdemon, it gently placed the charcoal pencil on the ground and incanted something softly. A ball of flames quickly gathered on its palm and quickly turned into a spinning fireball. The footsteps approached. The two subdemons stared at the corner extending out the door and held their breaths. Liliana tried her best to make some noise to alert the person outside, but unfortunately, the effects of the paralysis spell were still obvious. She couldn't even move a finger. With the sound of footsteps approaching the corner of the door, the casting subdemon raised his hand, and the spinning fireball in his hand quickly shot out. Bang! An intense flare flashed, and the massive explosion seemed to shake the entire hall. The sliver of hope that Liliana had for escape was extinguished. The two subdemons looked at the surging flames outside the door and relaxed slightly. This was the end of common sense that had shaped Liliana's 16 living years. From her point of view, what happened next could only be described as unbelievable. Without any warning, a silver-white nexus appeared under the feet of the two subdemons. A powerful whirlwind instantly swept up the dust in the room and threw the two subdemons into the air. It was also the moment they floated in the air that two sharp ice thorns extended diagonally from the originally empty ground, accurately piercing through the two airborne subdemons. All of this happened so suddenly that Liliana only realized what had happened when the two subdemon corpses began to turn into black salt crystals and dissipate. Heavy footsteps sounded from the opposite direction of the explosion. She turned her eyeballs and looked over. Then, she saw the person. A man who seemed to have walked out of a legend emitted an aura of ice and blood. His face had signs of the elements, and his expression was a little gloomy. His grayish-white hair was disheveled, and his eyes flickered with silver light due to the abundant magic. His cheeks were slightly sunken, and his beard was more like a stubble. His skin was as pale as if it was covered in a layer of frost. He wore pitch-black bone armor, and the armor's shape was distorting and twisting like fire. Sharp bone spurs extended from his wrists and elbows as if they were growing on that person's body. The entire armor breathed as if it were alive. Countless runes and totems were carved on the armor, and they alternated with ice blue and blood-red light. These light beams finally converged on a fist-sized black crystal in the center of the bone armor. He held a staff made of pure frost in his hand, and a blood-red orb was embedded at the tip. Fire, lightning, and frost lingered around the blood-colored orb. They were three powerful spells that had been incanted but hadn't been activated. Just looking at the magic power contained in them seemingly froze her soul. The person first looked around before slowly walking to a spot 3 steps away from Liliana. Are the two the only ones? The person stared into her eyes and asked. His voice was low and hoarse, carrying an indescribable authority. Perhaps it was because she was too shocked, but Liliana didn't understand what the other party meant for a moment. She only asked in a daze, "What two?" After speaking, Liliana realized that she could speak normally. At some point, the paralysis spell she had been under had been dispelled. "Are they the only two subdemons here?" The person repeated his question. There's only the two of them," Liliana hurriedly replied. The person looked around the hall again and said to her, "I've already dispelled the paralysis spell on you. Try and see if you can stand up on your own." Liliana moved her limbs that were almost numb and tried to stand up, but she couldn't muster any strength. Before she could speak, a green light flashed, and Liliana felt her limbs slowly begin to recover their strength. Thank you." The person only waved his hand and walked closer to ask. "There are some things I need to confirm first. What day and age is it?" "Twilight Moon 24, or 25. I've been under the paralysis spell for the past few days, so I'm not sure how many days have passed." "No, I'm asking what year it is." This question made Liliana's heart palpitate, and she wondered if this person was a heretical mage who had lived here in seclusion for so long that he had lost track of time. Yes, this was the only possibility. Otherwise, How could such a powerful mage be willing to lower himself into living in such a remote ruin? The more Liliana thought about it, the more certain she became. Then, she couldn't help but be struck by fear. She had heard that heretical mages couldn't use the magic power of the astral world because they had betrayed the astral laws. Therefore, they extracted and tortured the souls of others, using the pain and despair of their souls as fuel for their spells. Looking at the other party's eyes that emitted silver light due to the abundance of magic, Liliana lowered her head and avoided his gaze. She stared at her boots and answered hesitantly, "Platinum calendar, 1886, hiss." Perhaps it was her imagination, but Liliana seemed to hear the mage gasp. But when she looked up again, the person still had the same gloomy expression. "Is there a problem? Let's not talk about this first. Do you know where those two subdemons come from?" Liliana replied, "I'm not sure. They only attacked us after my archaeological team entered this ruin, but a few days ago, when we were still in the Grief Mountains, the team scouts mentioned that something was following us, but we thought it was a beast like a dire wolf." With that said, her voice became softer and softer. The man suspected to be a heretical mage nodded thoughtfully after hearing her description. "I roughly get it. Sorry, I need to know. Is anyone else on your archaeological team still alive?" This question made Liliana's heart sink as memories of the attack on her team surfaced in her mind. "I hear something upstairs. Where did they come from?" "Will, protect the lady and leave first. By the Holy Spirit, that was a LV3 spell. They can see us. Light the torches. Run." "No, please, Lily, save me. It's eating me." Everyone's voice in the archaeological team seemed to echo in her ears. Liliana bit her lip and took a long time to squeeze out two words. No, the emotions she had temporarily suppressed from fear and shock erupted. She covered her face with her hands, and tears kept streaming through her fingers. "They're all dead. They were all eaten." After a long time, when she was done venting her emotions, the person placed a hand on her shoulder. "Let's go. Let's solve the problem at its root first." Chapter 4, It's Been 1,000 Years. Translator, Siktalan Platinum Calendar, 1886. The moment he heard the year, Zhou Mu couldn't help but gasp. He clearly remembered that the ending of Doomsday Watcher was in the 878th year of the Platinum Calendar. In other words, he had transmigrated 1008 years into the future. 1,000 years was enough for humans to evolve from cold arms to strategic arms for the practice of deterrence in the real world. How much can a world change in 1,000 years? How many of my companions are still alive? Do the traces I left behind still exist? What has this world become? And my strengths? Even if he was invincible across the continent 1,000 years ago, what level was he at now? When Zhou Mu thought of this, he couldn't help but turn his gaze to withering cold in his hand. At the very least, he won his first battle after transmigrating very easily. It was so easy that it exceeded his best expectations. As the first battle he encountered after transmigrating, Zhou Mu made ample preparations. He first used two support spells, Feather Fall and Echo. While hiding his footsteps, he created fake footsteps in another direction to draw the enemy's attention. Then, he used the air and restraint combo Float and Glacier Spike. This set of crowd control techniques nailed the two subdemons as though they were practice targets. He even planned on carrying out the finishing touches with 3 single target damage spells with different stats: Wind Impact, Sphere Flame Purification, and Void Thunderstorm. In the end, just the damage from Glacier Spike killed the other party. In-game, the two subdemons were at most level 30. In the end, it seemed like he was a little too cautious. But the problem was, could two subdemons really represent the entire level of this world 1,000 years later? He had to find more qualified experimental subjects to make the determination. "Where are we going?" Just as Zhou Mu was in thought, the girl named Liliana behind him suddenly asked. They had already walked out of Twilight Fortress. It was almost noon, and the dazzling sunlight coated the ancient fortress with a layer of gold. The corrosion of 1,000 years had left this once indestructible fortress in ruins. Nearly a third of the building had collapsed into ruins, and lush vines had crawled up the building walls. From afar, it was impossible to tell the difference between the surrounding forest and the fortress. He never expected the fortress that once commanded the Allied forces across the continent to launch an expedition to the Moon Realm to be in such an abandoned state. Go deep into the Grief Mountains. There's a place called the Scar of Sorrow. The two subdemons from before probably escaped from there. I have to eliminate the source. Zhou Mu looked back at Twilight Fortress with regret as he replied. What's the source? Liliana asked. Lunar monster, Zhou Mu replied succinctly. What's a lunar monster? Zhou Mu, who was originally a little distracted, looked at Liliana in surprise. In an era 1,000 years later, does she not even know what a lunar monster was? As the largest antagonist faction in Doomsday Watcher, an existence that had almost destroyed the world, Zhou Mu wasn't sure if this was good news or bad news. Then, you should at least know what the Moon Realm is, right? Liliana nodded. I've learned from Introduction to Theology that the Moon Realm is an illusory reflection created by the Void Sovereigns because they are jealous of the beauty of the Holy Spirit's creation and want to imitate it. They block most of the light at night, turning it into a void that fills the stars and a demon realm that hangs high in the sky. But these should just be myths and legends. Zhou Mu sighed. No, that's too general. In fact, that's not the case at all. The Moon Realm is essentially an upper plane that reflects thoughts. It's filled with all kinds of monsters born from extreme emotions and thoughts, and the so-called Void Sovereigns are the strongest existences among those monsters. Zhou Mu ignored Liliana's blank expression and continued. As for subdemons, they are fragments peeled off from the main bodies of powerful lunar monsters. It's precisely because of this that they definitely won't appear alone. Lunar monsters are void existences to begin with, and they need to be anchored by obsession in this world to obtain a form from the void. It's even more so for subdemons that are fragments of lunar monsters. Zhou Mu recalled the game's lore. Therefore, powerful lunar monsters are definitely present wherever subdemons appear. Moreover, the more subdemons there are, the stronger the lunar monster will be, being their main body. Zhou Mu stopped and waited for the other party to digest the information. After a while, Liliana asked, then, why are you so sure that it will be in that place called the Scar of Sorrow? This is because it's very difficult for lunar monsters to reach this world. They have to find a weak spot between the world and the Moon Realm. The Scar of Sorrow is one of the weakest spots between this world and the Moon Realm on the Vic continent. Therefore, as long as they are summoned on the right day and through the right ritual, they can be successfully summoned. A few days ago was the perfect date. A few days ago? Liliana asked curiously. Didn't you say that today is the 24th or 25th of Twilight Moon? Liliana nodded. 22 ND of the Twilight Moon is one of the Moon Realm Void Sovereigns. It's the summoning day for the Lady of Starvation, Camilla. This is the only day in a year when she can project her strength into our world. Zhou Mu looked at Liliana and continued in a meaningful tone. Lady of Starvation is a generous Void Sovereign. On her summoning day, as long as someone offers enough sacrifices, they will basically receive a response. Liliana quickly understood what the other party meant. You're saying, someone wanted to kill my archaeological team by summoning a lunar monster? Why? Zhou Mu waved his hand. I can only say that it's a possibility, or perhaps it just happened. Of course, it's also possible that they weren't summoned from the Scar of Sorrow but came from somewhere else for other reasons. No, that won't happen. Zhou Mu's words reminded Liliana of the many times she had heard subdemons mention the name of the Lady of Starvation. But why? She only came here to finish her semester project. Who could she have provoked? We're here. Along the way, Liliana pondered over this question until Zhou Mu suddenly stopped. This is SHH. Zhou Mu turned around and gestured for Liliana to keep quiet. It looks like we aren't the first here. 1,000 years later, even my weakest follower has become a demon king. Chapter 5, Wuxia World Chapter 5, Genius and Stumbling Demon Translator. Seektalan. The altar consecrated the statue of the Lady of Starvation, Camilla. It was a sickly female statue made of colorful fungi. From afar, it looked like a rotten tumor or something else that made one uncomfortable. However, if one took a closer look, one could sense a certain sinister beauty in it. I lost contact with two pieces of debris in that ruin. The demon sitting under the altar and staring at the goddess statue suddenly spoke. It was a fat monster that resembled a mountain of flesh. It held a rusty dagger in its hand, and its head had twisted horns like dry branches. It was very tall, and it was much taller than ordinary male adults while still sitting. It was deformed, and its entire body was covered in strange sarcomas. Its skin was covered in festering and rotten marks. Do you want to take a look? The person who replied was a man in a gray cloak. He sat on the other side of the altar and held a lead-colored staff. His figure could be considered muscular, but he looked very thin when compared to the demon beside him. It's unnecessary. The best time for the anchoring ceremony is soon upon us. As long as this body's contract is completely anchored in the depths of your soul, my range of movement won't be limited by this altar. When that happens, whether this place is discovered by the others won't affect our subsequent actions, the monster with the rusty dagger replied in a dull voice. When the time comes, I can even use the people from the town at the foot of the mountain as a sacrifice before I leave. Don't be too ostentatious, psoriasis, the gray-robed man warned. Even if the churches in Blackwater province are significantly weaker than the other places in the empire, causing too much commotion will still attract the Seal Temple's investigation. When that happens, it will affect our master's plan. Nobody benefits from it. Speaking of ostentatious, perhaps dissatisfied with the other party's attitude, the monster named Psoriasis narrowed its eyes. That can't be more ostentatious than selling the ruins. Map of the Grief Mountains to the Offa University students, right? Although the ritual requires fresh sacrifices, aren't you afraid that the parents of one of the missing will hire a high-level adventurer team to search the mountains? Let me remind you, we tricked students from a noble institute of higher learning in the name of archaeology for them to be our sacrifices? Or are you still brooding over your expulsion from Offa University back then, David Obies? The gray-robed man named David Obies only replied emotionlessly to the demon's provocation. Most of the archaeology students study healing and shadow rays spells, which are more compatible with the sacrificial blood you need. Moreover, they are stupider, easier to deceive, and easier to deal with than an adventurer team. That's all. Psoriasis grinned and was about to say something when his expression suddenly changed. The barrier I set up outside the Scar of Sorrow has been destroyed. Really? David's expression changed slightly. Psoriasis closed his eyes and sensed it before nodding. That's right. It was cracked from a single point, and it's collapsing now. Is the destruction of the barrier coming from that ruin? David asked in a deep voice. Yes, but the method the other party used is very primitive. He didn't use a cracking method and instead used pure magical power to destroy it. Hearing this, David's solemn expression eased a little. Using a mana stream to destroy the barrier meant that the other party was most likely a newbie, either because he didn't know how to conserve his precious mana or because he didn't know how to destroy the barrier. Was it a lost explorer? Or was it another archaeological team that fell for their ruse? However, no matter who it was, he wasn't letting down his guard. He had been preparing for this ceremony for over a year. He couldn't treat any seemingly trivial latent risks carelessly. Then, let's not wait for the ceremony's prime time. Let's begin the anchoring. Don't complicate matters. Psoriasis nodded its fat head in agreement. Then, it stood up and chanted an obscure moon realm incantation. Power spread as Psoriasis chanted the incantation. The trees around the altar were snapped by an invisible force, scattering broken branches and leaves all over the ground. But if one observed carefully, one would discover that the brightly colored bacteria on the broken branches and leaves began to spread constantly. Thin strands of bacteria kept extending, and the area around the sickly life became extremely vibrant. Jomu, who was observing the altar, felt someone tug at him. He turned his head and saw Liliana looking at him with a pale face. Let's leave first before they discover us. Why? Jomu asked in confusion. I know who that gray-robed person is. He's not someone I can deal with alone. Let's go down the mountain and get help from the church. So who's that person? Jomu was a little intrigued. David Obies was once a student of Blackwater Province's Offa University. At the age of 18, he obtained the title of LV7 in both the summoning and shadow rays fields. He was known as the genius at Offa University who had the highest chance of reaching the master domain or even the legendary domain in the past 50 years. Is he considered your senior? Liliana shook her head vigorously. He was expelled from the university 2 years ago on suspicion of studying forbidden spells. Back then, the university contacted the Holy Spirit Church and imprisoned him as a heretical mage. He eventually fought the executors who were deployed to arrest him. Half of the dormitory building was blasted to ruins, and the entire team of elite executors failed to retain him. The executors were mage assassins trained by the Holy Spirit Church to deal with mage threats. To be able to fight an entire team of executors and escape, his strength was obvious. It's said that the Church sent people to search his house afterward. They found a large number of human organs used for primitive rituals in the basement, as well as the bones of many deformed monsters. At this point, Liliana was almost begging Jomyu. Ignoring the lunar monster beside him, a heretical mage with at least LV7 strength isn't an existence that we can deal with alone. Liliana's tone revealed sincerity, and Jomyu fell into thought over her words. Jomyu didn't know what strength LV7 was. Doomsday Watcher never had ratings for mages. It was probably a standard created by someone or an organization in the 1,000 years he was away. However, the master and legendary domains Liliana mentioned were indeed useful as a reference for evaluating a spell strength in-game: apprentice, expert, master, legend, divine realm. Every spell had a word that indicated its rarity. Although rarity didn't imply greater strength for a game, this was the intention of the game's planning team. Not doing so was a problem for the game mechanics balancing team. If this was the analysis, the implication of having a chance of reaching master was that one could use expert-level spells. But could this be considered a genius? Therefore, compared to the grey-robed man whom Liliana treated as a formidable enemy, Jomyu's attention was more focused on the lunar monster who was chanting. From the other party's appearance, he could be considered an old acquaintance. Stumbling Demon. Jomyu had a deep impression of this monster. He remembered how much of a pain this fellow was the time he raided the Lady of Starvation's Moon Realm dungeon, Lake of Entropy. Stumbling Demon was about LV 60 to 80. Its design completely ignored the might of physical and magical attacks and focused on stacking its HP and HP regeneration speed. Of course, if it was only a tank with low attack and high defense, that wasn't the reason Jomyu would call it a pain. The most disgusting thing about the Stumbling Demon was that it would obtain a halo that constantly caused abnormal statuses after being injured. The more HP it lost, the stronger the halo's effect. It wasn't a threat, but it was fully capable of disgusting the player. Every time he encountered a large-scale encounter, any Stumbling Demon mixed into the enemy's lineup as a tank would significantly increase the battle's difficulty. But then again, if it was only summoned alone, the Stumbling Demon would only be a wooden stake used to measure the damage. A wooden stake used to test the damage dealt was what Jomyu needed the most. With this in mind, he pushed away the tree branches in front of him and walked out. Behind him, Liliana exclaimed in surprise at his actions. As for the Stumbling Demon and the grey-robed man named David, they looked over at the same time. The man's sudden actions threw Liliana's mind into chaos. For a moment, she couldn't figure out if she should run or blame the man for his suicidal behavior. However, Jomyu turned around and patted her shoulder. "Don't worry. Didn't I say that we should solve the source of the problem first?" His words reminded Liliana of her archaeological team, and the people who had risked their lives to cover her escape. "But, oh, I almost forgot." As Jomyu spoke, he removed an ancient sunbird pendant from his neck and placed it in Liliana's hand. "The air here will turn nasty in a while. Put this on." Liliana subconsciously took the ancient pendant. The moment it came into contact with her skin, a warm current began to surge through her blood. An enchanted pendant? However, she had never heard of an enchanted pendant that had such an obvious effect without wearing it. By the time she came to her senses, the person was about 20 steps away from the altar. David Obies held his lead-colored staff and stood up. He looked back at Psoriasis, who was about to complete the ritual, and then at the white-haired, silver-eyed man. "Nice to meet you. Unknown magic chanter," he said very politely. "Nice to meet you. The genius from that university and the Stumbling Demon behind you." Chapter 6, Spider Silk Translator. Seektalan David Obies frowned when he heard that. It wasn't due to the disdain in the other party's words, but because he had accurately described the lunar monster's species behind him. 800 years ago, Great Sage Yates established the astral laws and divided magic into 9 levels and 13 series according to the distribution of the stars, completely reshaping the magic foundations of Vic Moon Realm. Spells that had always been in a gray area were excluded from the new system and became equivalent to a taboo. 800 years later, the astral laws system remained as firm as bedrock. The prohibition against Moon Realm magic had never been loosened. Across the continent, other than the ascetics sitting in demon burial and the living dead in the obliteration tower who were specially allowed to study the taboos from the Moon Realm, anyone who privately studied Moon Realm magic would be considered a heretic. This was the reason why he was expelled from Offa University back then. He was no exception even though he was the #1 genius in Offa University's past 50 years. The person in front of him could tell the species of psoriasis at a glance, which meant that he knew a little about Moonrealm magic. Therefore, was he also a heretical mage? Thoughts ran through David's mind before he probed, "May I know your name? I'm still not sure what my name means to this era, so I don't plan on revealing my name for the time being. Please forgive me." "What do you mean? What did he mean by not sure what my name means to this era? Did his name hold significance in this era?" Although the other party's random answer left him at a loss, he originally asked for a name to give the other party the impression that he was willing to communicate. Since he couldn't figure it out, he might as well continue the conversation. "Then, Mr. Unknown, I have a suggestion. If you leave and pretend as though you didn't see anything, I guarantee that I won't hurt you and the lady hiding behind you." "Why?" The other party didn't look at him but at Psoriasis, who was going through the anchoring ritual. "You and I are both so-called heretics who have betrayed the astral laws. Since we're the same, it's naturally better to be friends than enemies." With that said, he fixated his gaze on the other party's expression, hoping to figure out something. He wasn't afraid of fighting the person in front of him. Even if Psoriasis couldn't attack yet, dealing with a mage who needed to rely on magical power to break through the barrier wasn't even a problem for him. However, Psoriasis had yet to complete the anchoring ritual. Its only connection to the main world was the statue of the Lady of Starvation. If the other party was really a heretical mage who had a certain understanding of lunar monsters, his attacking the statue and severing the connection between Psoriasis and the world would put all his efforts over the past year in vain. Therefore, although David didn't plan on sparing the lives of these two, he had to act generous. It wouldn't be too late to kill these two after the ritual was over. After hearing his explanation, the person didn't say anything other than muttering the astral laws in a puzzled tone. He didn't even look away from the anchoring ceremony. "Sir, do you accept?" David couldn't help but feel a little anxious when he saw that the other party had been paying attention to the ritual and ignoring him, so he asked again. This time, his voice carried a slightly threatening tone. "Oh," the other party finally turned his gaze to him. "Both of you will die today." For a moment, David thought that the other party had guessed his plan and said this to expose the proposal he didn't plan on fulfilling. However, he quickly saw from the other party's eyes that the person was only expressing his intentions. The other party also didn't plan on letting him off. A comical feeling surged into his heart before turning into an unconcealable smile. "Ha ha 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 ha. A gutsy one you are." He laughed as he looked at the person, unable to hide his killing intent. "It puzzles me. Why aren't you willing to let yourself live longer? Why are you in such a hurry to die?" As David spoke, he slowly pointed the lead-colored staff in his hand at the person in front of him and then at the woman behind him. "Is it because of the lady behind you? Is she a survivor of the archaeological team from before? Or is it because you're too confident and think that just killing one or two subdemons and breaking through the barrier outside will—" "What barrier?" the other party suddenly asked, his voice filled with confusion. "The barrier you broke open with your mana stream before you came here. Don't you remember?" David sounded puzzled. Was there such a thing? The other party's expression was filled with confusion, and he didn't look like he was lying. This made David truly wary. Could it be that he wasn't the one who destroyed the barrier outside the Scar of Sorrow? Was it someone else? Was that person hiding nearby? Could this clown in front of him just be bait? David asked as he looked around warily. A barrier, the wall of shadows, was set up outside. "If it wasn't cracked by you, how did you find your way in?" After hearing his question, the other party finally revealed an enlightened expression. "Oh, that thing. For anyone below LV80, that thing. Ahem, it doesn't affect anyone above a certain level of strength. I probably didn't notice and walked in. As for cracking it, it's probably thanks to the enchantment on my armor that automatically cracked the barrier." David couldn't digest the information in his words. What was the meaning of this? The barrier that could block magic chanters below LV5 was cracked without him noticing? It sounded as simple as accidentally bumping into spider webs and destroying them while out. A bluff. It was definitely a bluff, David thought, but for some reason, he felt a chill down his spine. An extremely ridiculous thought appeared in his mind. The other party was very strong, far stronger than him. However, This should be impossible. He looked back at Psoriasis's ritual that was coming to an end. In the ether domain, he could clearly sense a pale and dirty comet plummeting into the depths of his soul. This stumbling demon from the moon realm was about to appear in the world through his soul anchor. He had to buy some more time. But this time, it wasn't because he was worried that the other party would destroy the altar and ruin his year of hard work. Instead, he wasn't sure if he could kill this unknown magic chanter in front of him alone. He needed to wait for Psoriasis's ritual to be completed before teaming up. As a spawn of the Lady of Starvation, if the stumbling demon could successfully descend into the world, even powerhouses at the master domain would have to avoid them. With this in mind, David planned on buying time through a conversation. Then, I want to ask again why you're here to be our enemy. It's because, I know you're stalling. The white-haired, silver-eyed magic chanter interrupted him. It's fine if you want to buy time for the stumbling demon's anchoring ritual to be completed. I'm also waiting for it to be completed. The other party's words made David subconsciously take a step back. Without an anchor in the demon summoner's soul, it can only rely on that disgusting statue to appear. However, the commotion on my side might be a little loud later. If I accidentally shatter that statue, that stumbling demon will have to obediently scram back to the moon realm. This wasn't good. The man who wasn't willing to reveal his name said, "As for why you asked me why I'm your enemy, although I know you only want to buy time, I think it's fine to give you an answer." David couldn't help but swallow when he saw the other party staring at him. Because you're a demon summoner and it's a lunar monster. The ruin not far away is the Twilight Fortress. Using that as a reason is sufficient. When the other party finished speaking, the pale and filthy comet in the ether domain happened to completely sink into the depths of David's soul. Violent magic powers began to surge in his blood. A strange feeling of mycelium growing in his body began to surface. The anchoring ceremony was completed. Psoriasis roared behind David, and the rusty dagger in his hand quickly became covered in dark green patterns. The distorted blobs of flesh on its body also began to proliferate and separate. When they fell to the ground, they squirmed and morphed. Long limbs and a huge head grew out of them, and finally, they turned into newborn subdemons. Psoriasis walked forward and held the dagger that emitted a decaying aura. He looked down at the magic chanter and said in a deep voice, "Shameless worm, tell me, how do you wish to die?" Chapter 7. Test Translator. Seektalin. The stumbling demon that spoke didn't attack directly. The first to charge over were the subdemons that had just taken form. There were a total of 7 subdemons, and their bodies were still covered in pus. 2 of them stood still and chanted spells, while the other 5 crouched on the ground and pounced at Jomu like hounds. Then, the first thing to be tested. He tapped the ground with withering cold, and a pure ring of fire quickly spread from the spot he struck. In the blink of an eye, it swallowed the 5 approaching subdemons. Purification ring of fire. A hot wind blew past his hair, and the 5 subdemons were charred. Jomu silently calculated the differences between reality and the game. Purification ring of fire was an apprentice-level spell. The description was release a clean ring of flames to incinerate the unholy. In fact, the damage was very light, but because it had the effect of removing frosted and cursed status, it was often used as purification in-game. A newborn subdemon was about LV 25, and the spellcasting medium he used was Withering Cold. As an ice elemental divine staff, its might would be reduced by 50% when using fire elemental spells. This way, if it were in-game, the purification ring of fire wouldn't be able to instantly kill 5 subdemons like before. Therefore, the true performance of a spell is closer to the game's description of the skills than the mathematical formulations based on the game's values. Jomu thought as he watched the subdemons turn into black salt crystals and dissipate. The 2 surviving subdemons finished chanting their spells at that very moment. 2 soccer ball-sized fireballs whistled toward him with flames trailing behind them. Bang! Hiss! A spear-shaped beam intercepted one of the fireballs, and the latter exploded in midair. Like a flower. The sphere of light didn't slow down after detonating the fireball and struck a casting subdemon. After a silent but dazzling flash, it was reduced to ashes. As for the other fireball, when it flew about 2 meters away from Jomu, it was swallowed by a sudden gust of cold air and silently extinguished like a cigarette butt thrown into an ice lake. Holy spear thrust, frozen. Wasteland. Yes, spells with trajectories and collision boxes can be intercepted. be it detonating them in advance or using a halo effect to cancel them out. This is different from in-game. It was different, but it was more in line with his intuition. Seeing the fireball he threw extinguish the moment it came close, the last subdemon on the field was stunned. Before it could chant another spell, a sharp icicle stabbed into its throat. Why aren't you guys coming? Seeing the stumbling demon and the gray-robed mage stand still, Zhou walked over and asked. Circling him, an area of 20 meters was enveloped by a frost storm. Frost constantly formed on the ground, and the air was filled with flying ice shards. David looked at the man and asked Psoriasis, who was connected to his soul through his consciousness. What do you say? To be able to use Frozen Wasteland, his frost spells have at least reached LV6. Are you confident in defeating him? It's fine. Provide support from behind. The damage from the Frozen Wasteland spell can better activate the Lady of Starvation's blessing for me. With that said, it moved its fat body and charged at Zhou. The rusty dagger in its hand emitted a sparkling green light. Looking at the stumbling demon charging at him like a dump truck, Zhou mentally compared it to the game. This stumbling demon's movements are much faster than the slow-motion module in-game, but Zhou dodged to the side, avoiding the other party's head-on collision. His reaction and speed were on a completely different level from his actual self. The gamers were ordinary humans after all. It was impossible for the game developer to really let them operate a character whose various values far exceeded that of ordinary people. For the sake of gaming, some stats could only be reflected in data and compromised in terms of actual performance. For example, agility would only increase critical hit and dodge. It wouldn't really increase the player's reaction speed. But when the game became reality, this data would be reflected in his physique. But in contrast, be it critical hit or dodge, he had to rely on himself. It was impossible for a miss to happen in-game because of a high dodge value. Then, for the next test, the stumbling demon stopped in its tracks, turned around, and swung its dagger at Zhou's head. Crack, 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 crack. This seemingly mighty strike was blocked by Zhou's raised vambrace. The collision of the saber and armor didn't produce a clanging sound like metal colliding. Instead, it was more like the sound of a blunt saber shattering on a frozen lake. Psoriasis felt as if it had chopped something into pieces. It grinned hideously and was about to say something, but when it saw the situation clearly, it said something that could probably enter the top 3 of the classic cameo lines. WH. What? The spot it had just struck was covered in a layer of frost that flickered with white runes, and the rusty dagger was stuck in that layer of frost, unable to advance an inch. White Frost Master-level Frost-type defense spells lasted for 3 minutes after being used. Every 15 seconds, the caster would be stacked with an additional layer of blocks, and every layer could reduce 75% of the damage received from the next physical attack. Stumbling Demon's offensive strength wasn't high to begin with, and being weakened by the defense of White Frost and the armor, this seemingly terrifying strike didn't even make Zhou tremble. Then, there won't be a problem with physical defense. An attack of this level won't cause a crowd control effect like slowing down and dizziness. He took note of the test results. Whoosh! A pitch-black energy arrow broke through the frost storm circling Zhou and struck his left shoulder. Intense shadow energy exploded on his shoulder pad. David held his lead-colored staff and stared at Zhou nervously, waiting for the other party to collapse under the effects of the curse after being struck by the shadow arrow. However, the other party only casually turned his head to look at him. Then, he waved his hand and deflected Psoriasis's blade, touching the spot where he had just been struck. Shadow arrow, huh? It's an expert-level shadow spell. When there's no corresponding countermeasure, it will indeed cause some light damage. Zhou recalled how he felt when he was struck by the shadow arrow. It was probably the impact of being hit by a small stone thrown by a naughty child and the tingling pain that was difficult to detect without carefully sensing it. Although there's no more HP bar, that strike should have deducted some HP, right? Yes, it would probably be in the single digits in-game. David looked at the man in horror. If it was only because he felt uneasy that he had killed all 7 subdemons in one strike, then what was happening now was completely beyond his understanding. Why could he still stand there as if nothing had happened after suffering a strike from Psoriasis and receiving a shadow arrow? What level was the other party at? Master? Or was it the legendary domain? Realizing that the other party was staring at him, David had the urge to escape immediately. Thank you. I have the results I need to know from the spell defense test. He thanked him sincerely. What did he mean? Then, it's time for the test of spell damage. In order not to affect you, before David could figure out what the person meant, a black shadow flashed past the other party's staff, and he stopped thinking. Shadow cage a spinning illusory ring. Blade passed through David's body and wrapped him in the center of the ring blade. Then, pitch-black darkness erupted from it, wrapping his entire body into a pitch-black gem that floated in the air while emitting a chill. Chapter 8, Keeping One's Promise. Translator. Sikdalan, why didn't you just kill my contractor? Psoriasis looked at the man in front of him and asked. It was exposed to the range of the frozen wasteland, and its body was covered in a thin layer of frost. The fine ice shards dancing in the storm constantly sliced open gashes in its flesh, but it ignored them completely. If he's killed, your anchor to the world will be gone. Didn't I say so? I don't want you to return to the moon realm early. Why? Jomu smiled and waved withering cold in his hand. With a flash of lightning, a shadowy teleportation door opened, and an ice crystal giant comparable to the stumbling demon lumbered out. Frost Soul, because I still have some things to test. Moreover, I've said it before. Jomu didn't continue. He only waved his hand to get the Frost Soul to step forward, and the tall ice crystal giant swung its heavy fist at Psoriasis. Bang! Stumbling demon didn't dodge or parry, allowing the other party's fist to smash into him. At the same time, he brandished his rusty dagger and struck the Frost Soul. Crack! Both parties attacked without any regard for defense, but the soul's seemingly heavy fist didn't even make Psoriasis tremble. Instead, its rusty blade sliced off a large chunk of ice from the other party. Psoriasis grinned hideously, and the green light on its rusty dagger shone brightly as it fought the soul. All right, let's begin with apprentice-level damage spells. Jomu gently tapped the withering cold and began a new round of tests. The stumbling demon and the Frost Soul were like two tumblers. They punched and stabbed each other with great vigor, but as tank characters with thick skin, the outcome of the battle couldn't be determined quickly, just based on their damage output. Another strike shattered a large piece of ice. Before Psoriasis could retract his dagger, several whistling wind blades struck its body, instantly slicing open several bone-deep gashes. Very good, continue. The magic chanter finally began to use offensive spells. Not only did Psoriasis not panic, but it also felt delighted. The gnarly wound caused by the wind blade began to wriggle, and dense mycelium appeared on both sides of the wound. Most of it connected to each other to heal the wound, and some of the mycelium extended out of his body. The wound healed at a visible speed while the mycelium that extended out of its body grew and expanded. Then, it silently exploded and spewed out colorful spore clouds. The brightly colored malady lingered around Psoriasis as a spore cloud, and the Frost Soul which had been exchanging blows with it began to slow down. Another strike landed on the soul, but this time, it didn't just shatter more ice. Several cracks extended from the spot where Psoriasis struck, and then they cracked like a spider web. The Frost Soul was reduced to pieces from the strike. Bright fungi crawled between the shards. The Lady of Starvation's blessing. Using flesh and blood as bait gave birth to a corrupted newborn. After shattering the Frost Soul, Psoriasis planned on turning around and finishing off the magic chanter. Unexpectedly, the moment it turned around, a ball of dazzling lightning struck it. Ugh! Psoriasis shook its head. Its chest was charred by the lightning, but at the same time, the abnormally lush life form began to squirm. Again, thicker spore clouds filled its surroundings and spread further. Not far away, a Frost Soul that was taller than before strode over. There's more? Psoriasis spat out a mouthful of dark green saliva on the ground and charged forward with its dagger. Okay, let's see how long you can last. Liliana couldn't understand what was happening. Summoning, storm, lightning, fire, frost, shadow, undead, life, illusion. She numbly counted how many types of spells that person had used. The astral laws stipulated that everyone could only study 3 spells at most, but it was like a joke to him. Even if he was a heretical mage, he shouldn't be able to use spells of so many types. It had to be known that even the heretic who started the withering catastrophe 50 years ago had only studied 5 spell systems. Moreover, that wasn't all. Liliana studied at Blackwater Province's Offa University. Although her talent was mediocre and she was only at the level of an apprentice, she was in the most authoritative mage school in Blackwater Province. She had extremely solid theoretical knowledge. It could be said that she knew the theories and effects of common spells among the 9 levels and 13 series stipulated in the astral laws. However, she had never seen or heard of at least 2/3 of the dozen spells that person had used. That wasn't all, the effects of those spells were also unimaginable, directly challenging her understanding of the essence of magic. From the mana fluctuations, the illusory blade that extended from his staff looks like an illusion spell, she murmured to herself. Since it was an illusion spell, why could it chop off the arm of the lunar monster? Was her understanding of illusion spells fundamentally wrong? The battle continued as more and more spells she didn't understand were cast from that person's hands. As the monster's injuries gradually deepened, the mist emitted from its body became thicker, and the range spread further and further. Be it the birds perched on the branches, the squirrels crawling in the forest, or the insects in the soil, any life form that came into contact with the mist began to twitch and tumble. Soon, they struggled to their deaths. On their corpses, dense mycelium grew out of every aperture before continuing to expand and explode, releasing new mist. Liliana saw it clearly. Just as she was about to escape the range of the mist in horror, the sunbird pendant that the person had wanted her to wear lit up slightly, and a faint golden barrier appeared around her. The mist instantly dissipated after coming into contact with the barrier, leaving behind a stench that resembled burning feathers. Liliana subconsciously touched the ancient pendant on her chest and looked up at the battlefield not far away. Over there, the colorful mist was so thick that one couldn't see what was happening inside. Only the constant sounds of combat and the occasional flashes of spells proved that the battle was still ongoing. Psoriasis roared and shattered an unknown number of frost souls before looking at the magic chanter. This time, the other party finally didn't summon a new frost soul. There was no intact spot on Psoriasis's body, but under the Lady of Starvation's blessing, all its injuries quickly healed. Even the hand that was previously severed gradually grew out a deformed limb that was purely made of mycelium. More and more mycelium extended out of its body, and endless spore mists spewed out like ignited smoke. Psoriasis slowly approached the person. The other party didn't summon a new meat shield or use any spells to attack. He just stood there quietly. It was probably because his mana was depleted, so its victory was at hand. A magic chanter was considered defeated when they ran out of mana. To be honest, this battle was harrowing. There were a few times when it was just short of being completely exiled by the magic chanter. Fortunately, the other party happened to stop attacking a few times and missed the opportunity to kill it. It was also thanks to him that the Lady of Starvation's blessing was maximized through its constant injuries and rebirth. Innumerable curses surged out of its wounds, turning the surroundings into a true land of death. I have to say, I'm quite impressed with you. As a mortal, your flesh and blood haven't been devoured by such a dense curse. Psoriasis stopped 3 steps away from the magic chanter and thought about the angle to chop off his head. The other party remained standing still. Why? You're not summoning those puppets, that's all show but no bite anymore. There's no need. The other party replied calmly, and his voice was much hoarser than before. There's no need. Everything that can be verified through you has been done. Psoriasis sneered and prepared to walk over and chop off his stubborn head, but just as it tried to take a step, it discovered that it couldn't lift its foot at all. It lowered its head, and a dark quagmire appeared under its feet. Countless pale hands reached out and grabbed it, constantly pulling it in. Didn't you ask why I didn't just kill your contractor and get you to scram back to the moon realm? Just as Psoriasis was struggling to break free, the white-haired, silver-eyed magic chanter walked in front of it and looked down at Psoriasis, who had half its body pulled into the dark quagmire. I've already told your contractor, and I'll tell you again, both of you will die today. Chapter 9, Judge Translator, Seekdalen die. How arrogant. Psoriasis, who only had his head left outside the dark quagmire, sneered sarcastically. That's right. Being completely controlled by this evil spell, it could only be at the mercy of others. Its body that had descended into the world would indeed be destroyed by this magic chanter. From a mortal's point of view, it was indeed about to die. However, hero, bring it on. Try killing me. Psoriasis laughed maniacally at the magic chanter. Use your weapon, your magic, your intelligence, courage, will, or something else to kill me. Although it was still enduring the pain of being bitten by millions of hungry undead, it couldn't hide its delight. Kill me like a fool destroying a reflection in the mirror, kill me like a lunatic shattering the moon in the water. There's no need to stand on ceremony, tear apart my shadow in this world in vain. If it's not enjoyable enough, go ahead and torture me before killing me, Psoriasis said ferociously. Then, I'll come back again and again with hatred for you and experience from my previous failures. I have infinite time and countless opportunities. So what if you prevail now? You can't keep winning, mortal. There's a very widespread story in the Moon Realm. I believe you've heard of it. After the other party finished speaking, Jomu slowly spoke. A long time ago, there was a most cunning and arrogant swindler in this world. He boldly made a bet with the 13 Moon Realm Void Sovereigns and won 12 consecutive bets. And every time he won a round, he requested the Void Sovereign to forge a weapon that could injure them. As Jomu spoke, he opened a deep spatial rift and reached in to search for something. But in the last bet, he lost, and his soul was eventually split by the Void Sovereigns. This story is often used to warn mortals not to bet with demons, but I think that person is a great warrior. This is because he left 12 weapons in the world that can injure the Void Sovereign's essence. Under Psoriasis's uneasy gaze, he drew a simple straight sword from the spatial rift. It was a normal sword that nobody would pick up even if it was dropped downtown. The workmanship was so crude that it was like the work of the son of an old blacksmith in a neighboring village during his first forging tutorial. Later on, someone traveled the entire continent to collect these 12 weapons and gave them to his companions. He established an organization specially used to suppress the monsters that couldn't be killed. Perhaps you've heard of it? That organization is known as the 13 Judges, and those who hold those weapons are known as Jomu spoke, he pointed his ordinary straight sword at Psoriasis's throat. Judge. When it sensed the power contained in the straight sword that could completely kill it, Psoriasis felt an unfamiliar emotion for the first time: fear. Wait a minute, I don't. Looking at the sword at his throat, Psoriasis was about to say something in horror, but Jomu ignored him and stabbed in. There were no gorgeous special effects or deafening sounds. The stumbling demon died silently. The corpse didn't turn into black salt crystals and dissipate. Instead, it was gradually swallowed by the mire and disappeared. He died as easily and straightforwardly as a mortal. A towering flaming vortex rose from the colorful spore cloud, incinerating the cursed mist in less than 10 seconds. Purgatory Storm, a LV8 fire spell. If she had seen the casting of this spell a few days ago, Liliana would have definitely cried out in excitement. However, she didn't show any emotion other than numbness when she saw LV8 spell. She had seen more LV8 spells today than in her entire life. The man who had shattered her worldview countless times today stood on the devastated, scorched earth and stared at the huge pitch-black gem floating in midair. Come over. It's safe now, the other party's voice sounded, and Liliana obediently walked over. The air was filled with the stench of burning feathers, and she felt the residual heat of the flames with every step she took. Liliana asked as she walked, "What about that monster?" "Dead." The person replied hoarsely, his gaze still fixed on the black gem. "Is David Obies imprisoned here?" "That's right. I still have some questions." Cough, 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 cough. F***CK. Cough, cough, cough. Before that person could finish speaking, he suddenly coughed violently. Liliana watched nervously as the person suddenly coughed until he was out of breath. Sometime after he calmed down, she asked hesitantly, "Are you all right?" I'm fine. I just choked on the mist. I'll be fine in a while." Was it only a choke? The scene of birds and insects being devoured by the mycelium appeared in Liliana's mind. If it weren't for that person's sunbird pendant, she would have long died in the terrifying mist. Recalling that the other party's pendant was still on her, she hurriedly took it off and prepared to return it to him, but the person only waved his hand, indicating for her to keep it. "Really? Such a precious thing. I might need your help in the future, so treat this as payment. Moreover, this is a replica I made while mimicking the Phoenix Pendant's enchantment. It's nothing precious. He enchanted it himself." Liliana's mind went numb from the other party's words. Jomu ignored the stunned Liliana behind him and took a few steps back. He then raised his staff and removed the effects of Shadow Cage. The huge pitch-black gem floating in the air turned into a shadow and dissipated, and the genius mage named David fell to the ground from midair. His concept of time seemed to be stuck at the moment before he was imprisoned. The moment he landed, he held the staff in his hand tightly and pointed it at Jomyu and Liliana. However, he quickly realized that the battle was over. Where did my contracted demon go? Perhaps because he couldn't sense the stumbling demon that was connected to his soul, David asked directly when he saw that the two people not far away had no intention of attacking. Since you can't sense it, it's naturally dead. Jomyu replied matter-of-factly. Lunar monsters were immortal. Even if their bodies in the main world were destroyed, it was like the shattering of a mirror's reflection, vanishing them back to the moon realm. It wouldn't injure the monster at all. However, David wasn't in the mood to correct the other party's choice of words. You defeated it. The other party nodded. With a clang, he threw the lead-colored staff to the ground. I surrender, David said decisively. I thought you would struggle. To be able to banish the stumbling demon alone, I have no chance of winning. Jomyu nodded, and a silver thread extended from the top of Withering Cold, binding the other party tightly. So what will happen to me? Will I be handed over to the church or, answer my question first? Jomyu walked in front of David and unfolded a parchment map for him. You deliberately spread this treasure map of the Southern Grief Mountains through the black market, right? Liliana's heart tightened when she heard this question. When they were still at Twilight Fortress, the mysterious mage had asked her in detail how she had found this ruin. After she told him how she had spent a lot of money to buy this treasure map from a mysterious vendor in the Nordland underground black market, the person took the map from her. In that case, this map, this ruin, could it be a trap from the beginning? Was it all her fault? Did her two classmates and the adventurer team she hired die because of her? Yes, David replied. I spread the map on the black market in Nordland to attract rash adventurers or archaeological teams. Be it the communication ceremony for the Lady of Starvation or the anchoring ceremony for the lunar monster, they all require, Liliana felt as if she had fallen into an ice cavern. All of them require a blood sacrifice. I know that, you don't have to tell me. That's not what I'm asking. Jomyu bent down slightly so that his gaze was level with his. I specially took note of it when I came over. Many of the places marked on this map are different from reality. For example, these forests on the map have disappeared. The largest pass is blocked by a landslide, and these rivers have already dried up. Jomyu pointed at the locations he had described on the map and said to him, Do you know why? Although it was a question, the other party didn't sound like he was asking him at all. David shook his head. It's very simple because this map is the Southern Grief Mountains from 1,000 years ago. Something in the man's eyes made the hair on David's back stand on end. Where did you get this map? Chapter 10, Name Translator. Seekdalan Jomyu was all too familiar with the map's style. Although it only depicted a small portion of the Southern Grief Mountains, the layout of this map was identical to when Jomyu opened up the map in-game. It was impossible for such a coincidence to happen. In other words, it was very likely that there were clues about his old acquaintances behind this map. He just didn't know if the other party was a friend or foe. Of course, from the fact that the other party had handed the map to a demon summoner, the probability of an enemy was higher. But no matter what, he couldn't give up this clue. Jomyu stared at the person and tried his best to sound intimidating. Where did you get this map? Silence. Do you not want to say it or can't? Silence again. So you can't say. Looking at the silent David, Jomyu continued asking. David gritted his teeth and replied, I can tell you anything other than the origins of this map. I'm not interested in anything else. This is all I want to know. Then kill me. The other party's answer surprised him somewhat. Since he had surrendered so decisively, he definitely wasn't the kind of person who wouldn't fear death. To make the other party choose to die so calmly, it probably wasn't because of greed or loyalty. It should be fear. After all, death wasn't the worst ending in this world. I know there are methods that can punish a person's soul when they reveal certain secrets, but coincidentally, I also have some methods that can torture your soul the same way. You have no idea, David interrupted Jomyu's threat. You don't know what it means to have your soul tortured, and you don't know what true horror is. You can rely on your strength, that's enough to banish a stumbling demon to threaten me, but don't think that I'll be afraid. I assure you that this bit of strength of yours is nothing compared to that lord. Very good, there's finally some progress. Tell me who the lord you're talking about is, and I promise to give you a quick death. The other party immediately shut up. Do you think I can't do anything to you as long as you stay mum? If you have such thoughts, I advise you to abandon them. Jomyu waited for a few more seconds. When he saw that the other party still appeared unafraid of death, he could only sigh helplessly. All right, this is your own doing. To be honest, even if you do deserve death, I didn't want to do this. With that said, he turned around and looked behind. Liliana. Yes. Liliana replied as if she had snapped awake from a dream. Jomyu couldn't help but frown when he saw the girl's dejected expression. It wasn't your fault. Liliana's eyes turned red as she choked. But how am I to tell their families this terrible news? How should I explain why I was the only one who survived? How should I face them? I don't know. Jomyu picked up the lead-colored staff that had been thrown away from the ground and handed it to the trembling girl. Tell them that the culprit is dead. Liliana looked up at him in surprise. This is also the only thing you can do to bring some comfort to the families of the deceased. The rest can only be left to time. With that said, a pitch-black energy beam shot out from Withering Cold and struck David, who was tied to the side. He looked up and collapsed. Jomyu walked over and half-knelt in front of the lifeless corpse. He released Withering Cold, but the staff didn't fall to the ground. Instead, it floated beside him as if it were alive. His right hand was covered in a hazy black shadow. As he reached into David's corpse, his hand penetrated the corpse like an illusory ghost and pulled out an equally illusory humanoid outline. It was the soul of David Obies. He looked a little puzzled until he saw his corpse lying on the ground and seemed to understand what had happened. Where did that map come from? Jomyu didn't say a word. Instead, he used his will to produce a soul voice. He used his will to control the will of others. Master-level necromancy spell, Commandeering of the Dead. The expression on David's face changed from confusion to a daze, and then to endless affliction. What's the name of the lord you were talking about? Where is he? Seeing that the other party still didn't answer, Jomyu estimated how much the other party's soul could withstand and used Commandeering of the Dead again. The other party's soul began to tremble violently under Jomyu's command, and it looked like he could barely maintain his human form. A few seconds later, he gritted his teeth and squeezed out a few words with difficulty and slowness. Father. Father of the Crows, Thorn City. He didn't finish his sentence because 3 scratches suddenly appeared on his soul the moment he said the first word. With every word he said, the scratch deepened. When he said the name Thorn City, the claw mark tore his soul to pieces. Looking at the tiny specks of light that filled the sky when his soul dissipated, Jomyu fell silent. This was the first time he had seen a spell that had never appeared in-game. He didn't even know how to stop it. Father of the Crows. I've never heard of it. Moreover, Thorn City? Thorn City reminded Jomyu of something more pressing. That was to repair the now-ruined Twilight Fortress. No matter what, he couldn't let the place that carried so many memories remain in its abandoned state. However, it wasn't easy to restore the Twilight Fortress to its original state. The exquisite defense systems and functional designs in the Twilight Fortress were the culmination of the efforts of the strongest craftsmen and enchanters on the continent back then. Jomyu even doubted if he could replicate all the functions of the Twilight Fortress now that 1,000 years had passed. Even if he had to settle for the next best thing and only wanted to repair the outer framework, it wouldn't be a trivial project. Problems pertaining to ordinary construction materials and labor were fine. He could just spend more time and effort summoning elemental souls to do manual labor. However, the troublesome thing was that because it hadn't been maintained for years, the demon sealing runes buried in the structure had been deactivated. He had to build the entire fortress's rune system from scratch. This was a very important job, and it had to begin together when rebuilding the main body of the fortress. It was equivalent to taking the best possible route before a house was renovated. Otherwise, even if it was repaired, the Twilight Fortress would only be a stone fortress that dazzled on the surface. It wouldn't be able to withstand the invasion of the lunar monsters. Relaying the demon sealing rune system required a large amount of elementium silver, a demon sealing metal that had a strong affinity for all types of spells. Although his treasure haul had some reserves of elementium silver, they were only stored as specimens. They couldn't meet the needs of rebuilding the entire Twilight Fortress. The largest elementium silver mine and refinery on the continent was in Thorn City 1,000 years ago. With this and the fact that he had to investigate the mysterious father of the crows, it looked like it was indeed necessary for him to make a trip to Thorn City. Jomyu grabbed withering cold that was floating to the side again and turned to ask Liliana, I remember you saying that you studied at Alpha University in Blackwater Swamp, right? Liliana had never studied undead spells, so, from her point of view, the scene of Jomyu interrogating David's soul was just him walking to the corpse and squatting down. Then, he held something in his hand and stood up before spacing out. She nodded and then corrected him. It's not Blackwater Swamp, but Blackwater Province. Blackwater Swamp was its name from a long time ago. The other party didn't say anything to her on this topic and continued asking, is the headquarters of Alpha University still in Thorn City? What does he mean by still in? Hasn't it been in Thorn City since more than 1,000 years ago? Suppressing her doubts about the other party's strange question, Liliana replied, that's right. It has always been in Thorn City. How about this? Aren't you going back to school after this matter is over? I happen to have something to do in Thorn City. Since it's on the way, how about I hire you as a guide? As for the remuneration, I'll pay with the pendant from before. What do you think of this deal? How was this deal? As a guide, this deal was a windfall? Although Liliana wasn't an enchantment expert, such an enchanted item was definitely one of the highest grade items in the university's collection. It could probably be sold for more than 10,000 gold reals at an auction. In comparison, hiring a guide to Thorn City only cost about 10 gold reals. But the problem was that the other party was a heretical mage who had betrayed the astral laws. No matter which city he went to, he would be wanted by the church and the local overlords as long as he was discovered. Of course, she had no doubt that this man with unfathomable strength could easily escape, but when that happened, she would be in trouble as his guide. Moreover, more importantly, she didn't know anything about this person other than the fact that he was ridiculously strong. This wasn't a deal that could put her at ease. However, the other party had saved her life and even avenged her. No matter what, she had to repay this favor. The girl named Liliana hesitated for a long time before finally speaking. All right, you have my word. But before that, I need to know your name. Name, huh, right. What should I call myself? Only then did he carefully consider this question. Jomyu? This was a name he used in his previous life when living in the concrete jungle. But now that I'm in this world, do I still need to use this name? He was silent for a long time until the girl began to panic. William Kane. He spoke as if he was announcing something, naming the character he had played in his alternate life. The name that once resounded across the continent. My name is William Kane.